How's it going, guys? This is Ryo Murata, photographer based in Tokyo. As of 2022, I currently own two medium format cameras, one SLR, one point and shoot, and that's basically it. And people might say that that might be a lot. For some people, that might be too little. I mean, there is no correct answer of how many cameras you own, but I wish I had a camera that sits in between a point and shoot and an SLR. I mean, it's easy as a point and shoot, however, not as like thought conscious when shooting with an SLR because you had to do all those manual settings and stuff like that. So back when I was in photography school, like 6-7 years back, a fellow classmate actually had a Rollei 35 film camera, which amazed me back in those days because of its like small form factor and it's a fully manual camera. However, due to its high price, and if you ever use a Rollei 35, I never used it, but I've seen a lot of YouTubers making videos on it. It's actually really hard to like get the precise setting. It's similar to an SLR, but it's, I mean, you have to set all those shutter speeds, apertures and ISO and stuff like that, and I kind of gave up on that because it wasn't my type of camera. However, that form factor, that small form factor, appealed me a lot, and it's still stuck into my head. And right here, I recently purchased a Konica C35, which basically resembles a Rollei 35. And I would say no, it's not completely exactly same as a Rollei 35, but the small form factor caught me off guard, and I purchased this from a site called Yahoo Auction, aka Yahoo Oku. And a lot of local Japanese people actually purchase cameras from this site. Unfortunately, it's like an eBay, however, they don't do like offshore shipping. I mean, what am I saying? Like international shipping and stuff like that. So it's only meant for Japanese people selling and purchasing stuff for Japanese people, P2P, peer-to-peer, if I'm right. So unfortunately, I mean, it's not meant for foreigners. However, I was able to like get mine for roughly $30, and the price ranges in between $20 and $100 depending on the condition. And in my case, I was able to snag a decently quality one for roughly $30, which was a bargain for me. I'd like to sort of talk about the overviews of this camera. I haven't had enough time to test out with this camera, and if I include that into this video, it's gonna go beyond 20 minutes. So I'm gonna allocate that into a different video. With this video, I'm gonna be talking about the overviews and the sort of like the specifics of this camera in particular, and the not corporate, but the history behind this camera, etc, etc. For your information, you guys probably know Konica Minolta. Konica Minolta is basically two camera manufacturers that merged together to make a lot of SLRs. They have famous SLRs and cameras. However, this camera in particular happens to be made by Konica themselves before they merged together. So it's a significant like camera in the camera history because it was before Konica Minolta was born, and they actually wanted to sort of like make a travel friendly camera back in the days. And I guess they wanted to have this battle between Olympus's like Trip 35 back in the days. If I'm right, that camera came out in 1960, in the end of 1960s, and this camera in particular that I purchased, the C35, came around in that era. So there was this like battle going on of trying to get people to purchase these travel friendly cameras. And background information, background history for this camera, to make it short and sweet for you guys. Konica made 4 iterations of this camera. The first one is the one that I purchased, the C35, the original one, which was released back in 1968 to 1969. So they only did a 1-2 year run. And after that, in 1971, they updated it and called it the C35V, or the 5th, I don't know. And the second series, I guess, they removed the rangefinder, which was prominent in the first generation. And depending on where you purchase the C35, the name differs. Internationally, it's called the C35V. In Japan, it's called the C35 ENL. And the third generation, which came a year later, the same year, but later in that year, was called the C35 Automatic. In Japan, they called it the Flashmatic, which has some kind of advanced flash control. And their last series was called the Konica Auto S3 FD, if I'm right. And I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty details of what's different in these 4 varieties of products, but the main difference is whether or not if it's like a rangefinder or if it's not a rangefinder. And the automatic version, the generation 3 of the C35, can keep firing the shutter if the battery dies. So it's similar to the Nikon F3. If you have the Nikon F3, you know what I'm talking about. If the battery dies, you can fire the shutter, but you're stuck in a specific shutter speed. Nikon F3 is like 1/60th of a second. The Konica C35 can fire at 1/30th of a second, so it's not that useful if the battery dies. So keep that in mind. And the last iteration of the C35, the Auto S3 C35 FD in Japan, was the flagship and the last camera within the C35 series, which offered, the main difference was the newest or the greatest flagship camera, C35, had a brighter lens of 1.8 instead of a typical f2.8 lens on the prior versions. So the camera that I have right here is the original version of the C35. It's the most simple looking camera that I ever purchased in my life, and I mean, honestly, the aesthetics looks really good. I'm going off a little bit off topic, but going back onto topic, this is a fully programmed auto camera. Program auto means that the aperture and the shutter is automatic, so you don't have to fiddle around with those settings. However, there is a however, the focusing, you have to do it manually. So it kind of combines the best of the 2 worlds of a point and shoot and an SLR. So like a Nikon F3 actually. So program auto, you basically don't have to think about the exposure. You don't have to carry a light meter. There is a light meter inside this camera, which, because it uses a battery, the battery is used to operate the light meter inside, and the camera itself automatically reads the exposure, automatically changes the shutter speed and the aperture, and all you have to do is change the focus wheel on the front of the camera and just take a photo, and that's basically it. So this camera comes equipped with a Konica's Hexanon 38mm f2.8 lens, really sharp lens. Only shot 1 roll with it, but it produces really great results. I mean, 38mm is in the between of a wide and a telephoto, so I mean, it's like a 35mm. You have enough space to shoot whatever subject you want to shoot, and if you run out of space, just take 1 step backwards, and in most cases you can probably compose within that like distance. And what's really interesting, and one of the reasons why I purchased this camera in particular, is that this camera system is really compact. In addition to that, there's an ISO dial on the front of a camera, and if you shoot with film, this is really important, because unlike point and shoot cameras where you basically, after you stick in the film into a point and shoot, the camera automatically reads the ISO on the DX coding, and it basically, you can't change that. If you're shooting with the ISO of 100 type of film stock, the camera reads it ISO 100, and basically on a point and shoot have to sort of like shoot at box speed. This camera, on the other hand, you don't have to do that. You can basically force this camera to like shoot at different ISO speeds. So if I'm shooting with a Fujicolor 100, ISO 100, I can force this camera ISO to be like 50 or maybe 32, so I can basically overexpose by 1 stop or maybe 1.5 stops if I wanted to. And it's important to like shoot on the overexposure side, because then you won't have the muddy type of shadows and you will get a sort of like a pastel look in your images, and you can achieve that with this camera. And oh yeah, I just realized it right now. So the max you can shoot or change the dial of the ISO is up to 400, so you can shoot at 400, 200, 320, 200, 160, 125, 100, 80, 80, 64, 50, then 32. So you have a lot of options, but if you're like shooting with ISO 800 type of film, Portrait 800, you don't have that setting, so you have to make it 400, so you're already overexposing by 1 stop. So in most cases I think you're alright with that if you're shooting with Portrait 800. This is like a really important thing about this camera. So I think I said it in the beginning of the videos that this camera runs on batteries, and that battery is basically used to sort of power up the light meter within this camera. So you need that to understand, I mean, the camera needs to have batteries to understand the exposure, the overall exposure, to take that photo. However, the shutter mechanism is mechanic, so you can fire the shutter and it won't break down on you. But yeah, going back onto topic, it runs on batteries, and back in the days, the manufacturer suggested, highly recommended you to use the MR44 type of batteries, which the M stands for mercury based, and back in the days it was legal, but now 2022 mercury based what we call batteries are illegal, so you can't get a hold of an MR44. But thankfully, due to technological like advancements, there are LR44 batteries which do fine in this camera. But please note, I'm not a physics, so I'm not good at like explaining things, but back in the days, the MR44 type of batteries used 1.35 volts in that battery to power it up. And however, today's like LR44 batteries, if I'm right, uses 1.55 volts, so it's like 0.2 volt stronger than the mercury based batteries. And what happens is that if you stick in an LR44 battery in here, I think a lot of technicians in Japan said, and I saw a bunch of people talking about it, is that the sensor, the photo resistance sensor within this like camera, the part where it basically observes the light coming into this camera and tells the exposure and tells the camera what shutter speed and what aperture to choose, because it has the LR44 battery has too much power. There is a little bit of oversensitivity going on within this camera. So when you're shooting with this camera, I highly sort of suggest like sort of like overexposing, not overexposing, but like when you like if you're shooting with a Fujicolor 100, you might overexpose by one stop. So I have the dial set to 50. However, because I'm using an LR44 battery that's being oversensitive, it might read the light too strong and I might get a sort of like a dark image, so I might need to sort of like shift the ISO back down again to 32 to get the optimum results. So keep that in mind. I'm not a physician, so I'm not good at physics, so I'm not good at explaining it, but LR44 has a powerful like voltage compared to the typical MR batteries, which was designed for this camera. So you might get a really dark image if you shoot at box speed with this camera. So other than the camera running on batteries for the the light meter inside, the shutter mechanism of this camera is unique actually, because it is made by a company called Copal. And if you shoot by 4x5s, you know what I'm talking about, because Copal is a famous shutter company back in the days. And before I became an e-commerce photographer, I worked at an advertising agency as an assistant. And even now today, advertising agencies use 4x5 cameras, if you guys know what I'm talking about. And back when I was an assistant, we used 4x5 cameras combined with a phase 1 system. And if you guys use a 4x5 cameras, you have the option of swapping the 4x5 lenses, you know what I'm talking about. And back then, the majority of the although the lens manufacturers, there's various manufacturers back in the days. There were Nikon, there were Fujifilm who made the 4x5 camera lenses, and Schneider Krashenov, if I'm right, for phase 1 and stuff like that. And however, the shutter mechanism was mostly, the majority of them were made by Copal, and they are even now today a reputable brand of making mechanical shutters that never break down at all. So I mean, in terms of the shutter quality, you can't go wrong with this camera, because, and at the same time, it kind of makes me wonder why a really great shutter company wanted to make a shutter for this tiny camera, for the consumer. So that's really fascinating when you look at the corporate history of this company, Copal and stuff like that. I'm going off topic. So if you like, if you're ever using this for prolonged use, I'm highly confident that the shutter mechanism won't fail, because it's made by a really reputable brand. so keep that in mind. And in addition to that, it does have a self timer, so if you want to take group photos, you can do with this camera. If you have it on a tripod, the self timer works flawlessly. And what's interesting about this camera, it has a bulb mode, and I never use this camera extensively, like I said, so this needs to be tested, because this camera, like I said, is a program auto camera, so the camera itself decides the shutter speed and the aperture. However, it has this bulb mode, meaning that if you stick a cable release on this, as long as you press the shutter opens up and you can basically take a photo. So I don't know how the aperture is gonna like sort of like fiddle like become when shooting with this camera in nighttime. Actually, I wonder if it will stick around in the smaller apertures of f11, f16. So that's like one of the things I want to test with this camera. So, and last but not least is the rangefinder. This is a rangefinder type camera, and you guys know I shoot with a GW690. I love rangefinder types of cameras. I don't own a Leica, unfortunately. However, this rangefinder, I never use a Mamiya 7, and people will say that the Mamiya 7 has some kind of tinted glass in those like fine viewfinders. This one in particular has tinted like sort of like glass in the viewfinder, and when you look through it, it has this sort of like magenta purplish tint to it. It's like wearing those types of like sunglasses. And because it's a rangefinder, I have this lens hood on, so let me take this off. You won't have any issues composing with this camera. However, if you have a lens sort of like hood like this one, focus. When you have a lens filter attached on this, when you try to focus, you won't have any trouble, but you won't be able to see the right bottom corner of the frame, so you might have issues with that. It basically interferes with when you're composing, but when you're taking the photo, you won't have any problems. And in addition to that, I don't know if you guys can see it, but I tried shooting with a mirrorless camera. I don't know if you guys can see the viewfinder, but on the right hand side there is this sort of like light meter, which basically moves up and down, and you can basically get the gist of what the exposure will be. So I'm in a dark environment, so the light meter's not working at all. So if I go into a bright area, it becomes 125 shutter speed, f4, something like that. So you can get a gist of what the exposure is going to be within this camera, although it's doing it automatically for you. And if you know if it's f4, if you know if it's f5.6, or if you know if it's like f8, then you get some kind of idea of how much would be in focus. But this is sort of like the negatives of a rangefinder. You can't predict how much is going to be in focus and how much is going to be, you know, out of focus. And that's the great thing about SLRs like Nikon F3, F2, those types of cameras. You can predict beforehand what's going to be in focus. However, rangefinder on the other hand, same for the GW690, it's almost impossible to tell how far it's going to be out of focus. So I mean, there are trade-offs between rangefinders and SLRs, so keep that in mind. Other than that, this is going to be probably my best purchase for this year. I mean, this camera was in really great condition. There is a dent, unfortunately. However, for this size and for $30, I mean, there's a lot of cameras like point and shoots above $30, which are not really good, but I might actually choose this if this is sort of like your first film camera, if you're sort of contemplating in between a point and shoot or this. I mean, point and shoot, you have less flexibility. This, you have more flexibilities because, like I said, you can change the ISO dial, and because you're focusing with your hands, it intentionally forces you to think about your compositions, and you can basically learn more from this camera. And yeah, that's basically it. So hopefully I've covered almost everything about this camera in this video, and hopefully it won't go over 20 minutes, but my future videos will try to make a video on this, of the shooting experience and etc. etc. So yeah, If you have any questions, if you have any comments, or if you own a C35, leave it in the comments below. I'm happy to reply. And yeah, cheers. We will see you next time. Peace.